Okay, so welcome to the fourth lecture of the Neural Network Architecture Seminar at the Towards AI Discord server. Today we are going to see convolution. In particular, well, we're going to talk briefly about CNNs and the convolutional operation. Then we're going to talk about deep learning for image processing and the AlexNet architecture, and how it revolutionized the field, and from there different improvements and concepts that came in the last decade, particularly Inception network in the GoogleLeNet and residual networks in ResNets. We're going to touch on object identification on two stages as presented on RCNNs, and in one stage as in YOLO. We're going to briefly mention how to improve one-stage architectures through better losses on the retina net, and to conclude with the state-of-the-art architectures based on fully convolutional networks and the UNet architecture. So CNN are the best of both worlds. You have something that is biologically inspired, yes, and that involve a very steep parameter reduction compared to a fully connected neural net. The key concept in CNNs is the idea of a kernel, of a function that gets applied over a sliding window over the input, and this sliding window can be one-dimensional or n-dimensional. In our case, today we are going to be looking at the image processing, so in that case images are two-dimensional. This kernel is a small neural net that gets applied then to that particular window and produce an output from there. And this kernel can be, and for many years have been, written by hand, or it can be learned using a stochastic gradient descent. And one of the advantages it has is because all the different patches, all these little windows over the image share the same kernel. Those shared weights can be then trained and make very efficient use of the training data. Also, it means that it handles variable length input. Yes, it doesn't matter how big is the image, you could potentially use the same kernel to produce the output. More importantly, particularly for this for this seminar of neural network architectures, the use of convolution and CNNs capture an inductive bias that is compatible with vision tasks. You have locality, you have translation invariance, and you have ideas regarding the type of normalization you do over the image in terms of bright processing that are key for success in vision tasks, and the network captures all those biases on itself, which means that you don't need training data to learn them. The network architecture already enforces them, and because they go hand in hand with the problem itself, then the data is much more efficiently used, because the data then can be used to learn things relevant to the task rather than these inherent issues. So if you have never seen CNNs and the convolutional operator, I highly recommend you to take some tutorials, and as I said, that this information is all over the web, but a very quick refresher on that. As I was mentioning, the idea of CNNs are based on kernels, which is in this image taken from Wikipedia is the little matrix in between the input and the output. Yes, that one that has 5 in the center, that's a kernel. And kernel has then this it captures this processing that is being done from the input to generate the output. A kernel has a height and a width, yes, and then the kernel is applied in this case to the corner, to that first 7 in the input image. What it does is the center of the place where the kernel is being applied corresponds to the center of the kernel, the 5. And the numbers, and in this case is a linear kernel, are just applied, multiplied and summed up. Of course, in this case, because we are at the corner of the image, there is a number of items that are not defined because they fall outside the image. Yes, those ones are solved then by padding. And in this case, we are padding with a repetition of the closest number. So, as you can see, the 7 pads that corner, and then the other 6 pad the next one. So with this, we can then do all these multiplications and then sum up the numbers and obtain the output value. So in this case is 9. Once we are done with this process, we move the kernel, and we can move it one element to the left or to the right or above or below, or we can move it for a longer period. We can move it 2 or 3 times, or 5, or etc. That's called the stride at which the kernel is applied. Of course, if we apply it with a stride of 2, then the number of features we obtain as output is going to be reduced significantly. And that type of reduction is an important reduction that the CNNs do by doing striding. Finally, each of these kernels can be stacked, so you can have the kernel can have produce multiple features, yes, and also can run on an input that has multiple features per position. Those are called the channels, and so you have a number of input channels and an output channels. And in general, when we discuss about CNNs, we talk about the height, the width, and the number of output channels. The other elements, the number of input channels are taken by the architecture. So today we are going to see a number of architectures that are described by a series of neural nets that have CNNs describe a height, width, and a number of output channels. The last operation that we need to know to fully describe convolutional architectures is the idea of subsampling. Besides using strides, strides just will move the kernel and drop the values for the other points because they are not even calculated. Another way we can reduce the size of the image is by using subsampling. For example, we can take little blocks of 2 by 2 and take the maximum value computed over these 4 numbers. Yes, that's a max pooling type of subsampling. And there is also average pooling, and I guess you can also define minimum pooling. So then a convolutional network architecture is defined as a number of convolutions followed by subsampling that produce different level of feature maps. So as we keep going deeper into this, we are getting a more abstract representation and more complex features that are produced for regions of the image. Yes, each of these little boxes inside the feature maps has what is called a receptive field. It has the units within the input that are used to calculate the values in that position. After that, the initial architectures, what they were doing is that they were taking the feature maps at a certain level and running them to a fully connected network to do different tasks. So then the CNNs are used for feature generation, and the result of those features are then fed into a fully connected network. Yeah. So to summarize a little bit this, we use the CNNs together with subsampling layers to achieve higher order features, and because this is in AlexNet and other networks is then combined with a fully connected layer, then the variable size input in practice cannot exceed a certain size. Why? Because if we go back to the previous image, yes, sure, all these feature maps are of any size, but once they are fed into the full connection at the end, that fully connected has a maximum image size that it can handle. Yes, so in that position, then the size of the image gets fixed. As I was mentioning, yes, due to max pooling, the receptive field increases as the depth, as we go deeper into the network, it goes changing. Interestingly, at the end of the lecture today, we're going to see fully connected networks and UNets that don't have the problem, that don't use fully connected layers, and such they don't have the problem of having to set a maximum input size. So there is in the paper pile there is a relatively recent 3 years ago survey on deep learning for generic object detection. There it discusses that there are 4 tasks. I use different names and I'll change a little bit, but there is classification, object detection, semantic segmentation, and panoptic segmentation. And today we are going to talk about the first 3, and in the lecture on visual transformers we are going to talk about panoptic segmentation. But here you have some examples. The first example, this is just object classification. Instead, I would like to think of it just as image classification. Yes. Then you have the type of classification of with generic objects with bounding boxes. So you have small boxes around items with a particular class. Semantic segmentation takes this one step further. One step further, that is every pixel is assigned a class. So instead of having bounding boxes, in semantic segmentation you no longer have bounding boxes and you have a class per pixel. Of course, clearly semantic segmentation is much more computationally intensive than the generic object detection. And finally we have what is being called right now panoptic segmentation, which is you not only assign a class but also an instance. So you can tell that one sheep, the salmon sheep, is different from the green sheep. Yes, and well, that one is of course even much harder, because many times you have items that are touching itself, like these 2 sheep here are touching each other. The orange and light blue sheep are touching, and you will have to distinguish the pixels of those 2. So how can we achieve this type of fits? Yes, the first thing is that in the last decade we have now really large data sets available with millions of annotated images, and we also have relatively inexpensive GPUs. However, as we now keep approaching for certain tasks human level characteristics, for certain others we are still very far, the entry level to the field has become prohibitively high. It has been interesting for me preparing this lecture and seeing that papers 12 years ago had experiments that were actually run on CPU. Yes, that's definitely not the case anymore. Okay, so this all starts in 2012. The citation is a little tricky because this is a communication of the ACM with a reprint of a paper from 2012. from Krizhevsky, Sutskever, and Hinton, called it the Imagenet classification with deep convolutional neural networks. And this paper, well, has received upwards of 100,000 citations. Yes, it's a massively popular paper. It rebooted the interest in neural nets. Yes, so we have a whole community of computer vision people who were working with feature-based systems based on SIFT, HOG, manually designed features, and then here they come with this system with 5 convolutional layers. It works better, yes, but the part that is really amazing about this system is that it has 60 million parameters, and it's only training them against 1.2 million instances. Interestingly, later work on that decade actually reduced the number of parameters. So how do they manage to achieve this? Something that is very interesting about this paper is that they call their system SuperVision, which is not necessarily a very memorable name. So in general, people refer to this system as the AlexNet because of the first name of the author, but that name doesn't appear in the paper itself. So this system took 5 to 6 days to train using only 2 3 gigabyte GPUs. The architecture splits the network then into these 2 GPUs that they communicate with each other at a specific layer. In the first lecture, we discussed about how GPUs, memories, and architecture sometimes modify the architecture. This is a very, very specific case. And in the paper itself, they even discuss about how the 2 GPUs produce a different understanding of the data, with one GPU focusing more on directions and the other in colors, for example. And as mentioned, because they have so many, so much data, so many parameters, and compared to the data, overfitting was a real issue. And they go about how dropout and variations over the data really help them overcome overfitting. So the different layers they use is they take a fixed size of the image, yes, and they need a fixed size because at the end they use a fixed fully connected network, and that size of the image is 224 by 224 with 3 color channels, and they run there kernels of size 11 by 11 with a stride of 4 pixels, which in turn means there are 96 kernel operations over the image. From there, they normalize the brightness of the colors, and they compute max pooling, I believe, and they run kernels of size 5 times 5 times 48. So you can see, as the network goes getting deeper, the number of channels augments. So in a way, you can think that as the responsive the field for each of the kernels increases, we start knowing more about that local context, and that knowledge about the local context gets expressed as a larger number of features that are being learned by each of these successive convolutions. So the third layer then does the same response normalization and pooling, and then uses a kernel of size 3 by 3 by 256, and the fourth and fifth don't use response normalization nor pooling, and they just use 3 times 3 times 192. So this network produced a performance of 16% top first classification and classifying 1,000 classes. Fast forward, now we are at 2%. Yes, so it has a massive improvement in performance. How did we got there? How we got to a point that image classification can be considered that we are now pushing a human level performance for that task. Not necessarily the human level performance of seeing objects in the wild. It is understood that humans can recognize about 30,000 classes, not 1,000. But the human level performance here, it comes from the errors on the data. That 2%, there are many images that you see and you say, oh, for example, you have the front of a car, yes, and you also see the grille of the car. Well, are you classifying it as a grille or as a car, right? So that's ambiguous, and it's ambiguous for people and it's ambiguous for a computer. So we're really at that level for image classification. So from the AlexNet to the present, how do we got there? There are two things that are very important from the architecture perspective that I want to talk today. One are inception cells, the concept of a network within a network that inspired the GoogleLeNet architecture, and then training on residuals, what is ResNet. So let's talk about them next. Inception architecture has received 47 citations. The name itself is a meme. It's going deeper with convolutions, and the idea of Inception is because around that time the Inception movie also came around. But this is a very serious paper with very serious results. They build upon theoretical results that indicate that sparse CNNs can be built layer by layer and can approximate functions properly. The problem of building sparse CNNs is that all the computational machinery we have available these days with BLAST libraries and GPUs, etc., are very good for dense computational frameworks. Yeah, so are very good for features that are densely packed rather than sparse. But they realize that they can approximate that sparsity by doing dimensionality reduction. And how do they do dimensionality reduction? They use CNNs of size 1 times 1, which are very strange animals, and we should keep them in mind because they are part of the transformer blocks. Yes, so by using these 1 times 1 CNNs, you can have an input that has a feature size of 192, and then an output that is at 1 times 1 of 256 say 192 goes to 64. Yes, so that way we are packing the original features in a smaller space. We are basically computing embeddings within the CNN execution. The theoretical results from Aurora also indicate that clustering neurons based on their activation is key to building these networks layer by layer. Yes, and that's the Hebbian principle we discussed in the previous lecture, used by Hopfield networks and RVMs. Yes, so the idea is that neurons that fire together should be wired together. So this clustering of neurons based on their activation can be approximated using CNNs by computing small kernels and concatenating their output. So then what they do is they take all these intuitions and they pack them together into a small unit of computation that they call the Inception Cell. This idea about building architectures based on macro components is key for later architectures. They take these Inception cells and stack 22 layers of them. And that achieves better performance, much better performance than the AlexNet, and uses 12 times less parameters. So let's just think about this. Do you have a network that is more complex, has more layers, but it has much less parameters and it performs better? This is a massive breakthrough, and that explains why this receives so much attention. Moreover, this idea of macro cells that capture some inherent important characteristic of the problem has also continued in neural architecture search. In the last lecture of this seminar that I will be presenting, we'll discuss how this type of macro cells can be learned using a neural architecture, but not learned, it can be discovered using a search process. From that paper, I want to bring this quote that says, if two convolutional layers are chained, any uniform increase in the number of their filters results in a quadratic increase of computation. if the added capacity is used inefficiently, for example, if most weights end up to be close to 0, then much of the computation is wasted. So I want to bring this point here because when we see transformers in the next 2 lectures from now, one of the problems with current transformers is that many of their weights end up close to 0. So it is very interesting to see that in the past decade there was a discussion about this efficiency, and there was a search for solutions that will address it. So the Inception Cell looks like this. You have, from the previous layer, you run in parallel 3 types of convolutions and a max pooling that try to capture this idea of clustering the activations of the neurons. This, of course, will blow up the number of features. And due to that, then they also add, so they call the one here in the left the naive Inception Cell, and then they add these boxes in cream that are dimensionality reduction convolutions, 1x1 convolutions that produce fewer features and are then fed into the other convolutions that expand them. So in the Inception Cell is one part of the solution to these questions. The other one is the residual networks. And one of the interesting things about preparing for these lectures that I was aware of residual networks before, but I realized after reading the paper that I haven't really captured their true importance. Yes, and well, the community definitely captured the true importance. According to the Wikipedia page of this paper, it's the most cited neural network paper. It has 151,000 citations, so that sounds that it may be the case. And what they say is, well, we do know that at that time, adding more layers at some moments start making things worse. But how come it will make things worse? Yes, we know that an identity layer should make things equal. Yes. So how can we, what to do about that? So what they say is, instead of wondering why the identity layer, why the network is not learning the identity layer, let's add the identity layer explicitly and then train on residuals. And train on residuals, that is training on the difference between the errors the network made versus what it should have, is similar to boosting, and it's a very popular machine learning technique. So by this simple modification, they improve performance, and this modification itself in the residual network we're going to see next, residual cell that we're going to see next, doesn't add additional parameters. So think about how powerful this is. They improve performance and they are without adding any parameters. And again, residual connections are also a key component of the transformer cell that we are going to see in 2 lectures from now. So this is how the residual cell looks like. We have the regular weight layer with a ReLU, and then after another weight layer with a ReLU, we add, just simply perform an addition of the original value. So this change, when you look at it from the perspective of doing a backpropagation, that means that now this layer no longer the layers no longer have to learn the output function, but they have to learn the difference between this value and the target. Yes, and that means that the layer has to all it has to do is focus on the type of problems the network is making. And if the network is really good, then the layer itself will have to be very close to 0. It doesn't have to make many changes because things are really good. So that's take us to this close to human performance in the classification task. So now we're going to move from classification to object detection. That is, to find in an object with bounding boxes. Yes. Now, those type of architectures, yes, they lose information about localization. Yes, as the layers become more informed, yes, they start referring to larger and larger parts of the image. So we know there is a cat here, but the exact position of the cat is very difficult to pinpoint. Yeah. So as a very straightforward idea is to say I'm going to use boxes through some box generation system that might not even need to be a deep learning system at all. Yes. And I'm going to then use CNNs to classify the boxes. And that's the intuition behind two-stage systems, of which we are going to see are CNNs today. Another alternative, yes, so the problem with the RCNN approach is that in general it's slow. Yes, you have to have these two processes and you have to run the CNNs multiple times. Instead, we can try to do a one-stage approach where we take an already trained high-performance classification network, what is called the backbone, and then try classification and box boundaries on top of them. And that's the technique called you only look once, and that we're going to see next. So RCNNs were proposed by Ross Girschik in 2014. This is a time where people were still using a lot of pre-deep learning techniques, and so then they were trying to get the best of both worlds, the best from the pre-deep learning world and this new information coming from CNNs. So the technique is called regions with CNN features. They use a technique to identify regions of interest, and then an ImageNet trained CNN that they have decapitated, so it doesn't do classification to obtain features over them. And from there, then they feed all these features over the SVM, so over a specifically made SVM to get the final regions. And they have been better than end-to-end deep learning system for many, many years. So here you have a little example of how they work. They extract the region proposal like 2000. Then they compute CNN features using something like the Inception net we just saw. And from there, they decide to apply different classes to the different regions. And that's the idea behind RCNNs. There is not much for us to look into them in terms of neural network architectures. A different system was proposed a little later, called it You Only Look Once. And this one allows for real-time object detection. So the RCNNs are more accurate, but they are slow. Instead, if you only have to run one neural net, then you get a system that is very fast. However, because you are only running one neural net, then that runs into some accuracy issues. YOLO has gone through many improvements and versions over the years. I think the last version is YOLO version 7, and it has become more accurate and been able to handle more issues. Yes, we are just going to discuss the original version of the algorithm. That one was built on top of the Inception net, and on top of that, it adds two extra networks: a network that predicts bounding boxes for grid segments, and an independent network that predicts object classes. So these two networks are separated. They are basically doing multitask learning that we saw on the second lecture. The way the losses are integrated, the paper itself acknowledges is not a good way. They're summing up the losses. I believe better versions are proposed and used in other incarnations of YOLO. And the last item is that the system produces a number of boxes with classes, and it requires something called a non-maximum suppression to find which ones are the best boxes. Later on, when we see visual transformers, those algorithms allow to do this without the non-maximum suppression. For this algorithm, the non-maximum suppression component tends to be one of the more time consuming compared to the other aspects. So YOLO then takes an image, split it into a grid, a fixed grid, predicts bounding boxes from each grid element, which is a little confusing because the bounding boxes are expand beyond each grid element. It's just that the features that converge on that grid element are the ones used to do that prediction, and the same thing with the class probability map. So the class probability is very easy to understand. It just gives you the probability for a given element in the grid. But both systems are using information that is using a larger context within the image. Yes, there are things that, for example, if you have a wheel, whether it's part of a car or it's part of a motorcycle, you will only be able to know that by looking to cells outside the grid. Yes, and the way the neural network features behave, you will be able to do that. Yes. So from these two outputs, the bounding boxes and the class probability map, then the system produces the final detections. And the architecture itself is really representative of the type of architectures of that time, where we start with we move from having a large flat system of 400 and 400 pixels with 3 colors per channel, and from there we start getting kernels. Initially the kernels are big, like 7 by 7, and then they start getting smaller, 3 by 3, 3 by 3, 2 by 2, etc. But the number of features we are getting are much bigger. Yes, here we are having 192, 256, 512, 124. And you can also see that interpairs there is dimensionality reduction happening with 1 times 1 convolutions. So at the end of this whole process, then we end up having a 7 times 7 representation of all the information we have acquired about the image, with 1024 features per location. And those are then fed into these fully connected networks that do the bounding boxes and the class probability map. Alright, so YOLO is fast, but it trails the FCNs in accuracy significantly, like 10 to 40% less. The problem with one-stage systems is that they see too many trivial instances, yes? And outside neural network architectures, Lin and colleagues propose this focal loss, a different type of loss that basically starts ignoring training instances that were too easy, and therefore focus the loss on hard cases, and they call that focal loss. Modifications of the loss for different purposes is a common technique. This is really the opposite of techniques that try to make the loss more robust, discarding hard cases like the Hoover loss. And they present RetinaNet as a baseline architecture using this loss. The interesting thing is that RetinaNet is as fast as one stage, but even more accurate than 2 stages object detectors. So you get the best of both worlds. And the architecture uses feature pyramids. We're not discussing them today. And then after that, they have the 2 subtasks as before, one for a class and the other for a bounding box detection. their system starts from a ResNet, and from there it expands them into feature pyramids. So this idea of so from here you already have the idea of you compress something using the CNNs, and then you expand them somehow. And so in a way the writing was in the wall for UNets, which is what we are going to see next. And so this situation is really interesting, because in 2015 Long and Shellhammer and Darrell published in CVPR this transformative paper. This is a really beautiful paper about how to see the CNNs as a fully connected system, and they kind of recast the previous work into this new framework, and they make some really good points in the paper. Yeah, so the main realization they say is that, well, if you have a CNN, a series of CNN layers followed by a fully connected network, that's still can be, we can still think the last layer, that fully connected network, is a CNN, but it's just a very big kernel. It's a kernel as big as the whole image, so to speak, but you can still apply that to a larger image. Yes, we just move that whole system around, and that gives us a classifier network that can be used as what they call FCNs, full CNNs, and that can take any input size. So the intuition then is this idea of what they call convolutionalization, for a very convoluted word, where if you take a classifier, yes, that says that is a tabby cat, and then you can run that over the whole image and obtain a tabby cat heat map that tells you for each location in the image how likely is that location to belong to a tabby cat. So therefore what we want then is to do image predictions at every pixel. That is semantic segmentation. So we can have global information resolving what, while local information resolves where. The classifier can be trained as usual, so we can do supervised pre-training, but what we need is to recover locations, and that's quite hard because the network has lost locations on the upsamplings, on the downsamplings, yes. So we need to upsample. A simple way to upsample is that I do linear interpolation. So if you have a point that you know it represents 4 points in the original image, you can take the neighbors to try to figure out what will be the class for the other 3 points. But you can do even better than bilinear interpolation, and you can consider upsampling to be the reverse of a CNN filter and then learn the weights to do that interpolation. Still, the corners of the upsampling did not work well for them, and they have to rely to interpolation at different upsample levels, and the system become still coarse. And we're going to see some examples that can help to understand a little better why this LeNet style system loses localization information. So if you use a full network, yes, you get something. Here you have the ground truth, so you have bicycles and people on the bicycle and cyclists, yes. If you use a full network, the system is too coarse. It does know that there is a cyclist in the leftmost side, but it cannot really make it at that level. And also the bicycle becomes this green blob. But if you were to stop earlier in the network, then you can get more fine-grained features. Yes, and they allow that process by making what they call fully connected, fully convoluted network, direct acyclic graph. Yes, in which they take networks at different levels of resolution, and then they combine them. Yeah, and this process wasn't necessarily very elegant, not very high performance. So in a way, they come up with these great ideas, and they executed very well with them, and they were very, very close to make a network that was going to be really revolutionary. And that's when Ronenberg, Fisher, and Brox came in and defined the UNet. Yes, the most interesting thing about this is that this FCNN paper was published in a general deep learning venue, and well, it was a paper that received quite a bit of attention. Well, they published this UNet as an application of the FCNNs for very specific medical imaging segmentation, in a conference on medical imaging computing. However, what they were doing is a missing piece of the puzzle to make the FCN architecture work, that is to add residual connections from the downsampling path to the upsampling path. And this provides enough information for the network then to make quality fine-grained decisions. And this is a diagram that you will see over and over again if you read the recent papers on image processing, in which you take the image and you go through the same process. Like the left side of the U is the same type of processing we were seeing in YOLO or AlexNet or any of these, which we apply different kernels. In this case, it's a convolutional 3x3. Then we do a max pooling 2x2, and as we are getting deeper and deeper features, and then we start doing upsampling with the convolution, and we obtain an image of the same size as the input, well, almost the same size as the input as the output. The key difference, and that's why it's plotted in this shape, is that before and after each of before each of these upsampling and after each of before each of the downsamplings and after each of the upsamplings, we add residual connections to the inputs at that level. Yes, and that allows, therefore, the system to be able to be much more informed about the type of reconstruction it does. And that's what makes UNets one of the most useful and state-of-the-art networks that we know. From a researcher perspective, this also brings some interesting ideas, because you have, if you are up to date and you are following the state-of-the-art in research, in a way, these people won the lottery with this paper. Yes, they successfully found this missing piece and have a very substantial contribution to the field thanks to that. That should give hope to everybody to be able to accomplish this type of features. Alright, so that's what I have today. I would like to close up by saying that computer vision is also my base training. My PhD was in natural language processing, so preparing this lecture was quite challenging. So I would like to thank some people that have helped me a little bit, either with this lecture or with computer vision in general, particularly Professor Damián Brazotti from FAMAF, Universidad Nacional de Córdoba, that taught this lecture in the seminar, and well, Luis Bouchard from Towards AI, and Rupert Brooks from Le Laboratoire Fulab in Montreal. So thank you very much. Let's switch back to the channel and discuss seminar topics and questions. Thank you very much.